Hello, everybody. Uh, this is Anton Chaitkin. I'm here today with Lawrence Freeman, uh, who is a distinguished strategist about the present and future and past uh, of Africa and where it has to go in order for things to get much better. He's an old friend of mine, and I've followed his work for many years, and I think it would be of tremendous educational value for people who are looking at my work now to see something really knowledgeable about what's going on today and in the future of Africa. So welcome, Mr. Freeman. Can I call you Larry?
Yeah, that's fine. Glad to be with you, Tony.
Okay. I looked up to reacquaint myself. What's the wars that are going on in Africa? Wars and insurgencies. And I saw mention of conflicts going on in Egypt, Somalia, Nigeria, Tunisia, Burkina Faso, Niger, Mozambique, Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, Djibouti, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and even Kenya. U.S. forces operating in so-called anti-terror excursions that have been going on for 20 years. Definitely a failed policy. So first of all, let me ask you this. What is the origin, or what could you say in a general way about these conflicts throughout Africa?
Okay, thank you, Tony. Each one of the conflicts you mentioned is different, and there's different immediate causes, and there's different levels of intensity, and there's different levels of actually military conflict and people dying. But if you go back and you look at the cause of these wars, uh, what we see across Africa is a deliberate policy of not to develop these nations and to divide these nations as much as possible, and also to promote ethnicity or ethnic nationalism, more accurately, to divide these nations. And so the African nations that have an unusual history, they're the only continent where there was forced deportation of about at least 15 million people or more back from 1440 to 1840. Then they were divided up and colonized under the spheres of influence at the Berlin Conference. And then when they became independent, beginning in the 1960s, they were brought under the control of the World Bank and IMF financial systems. So they've never really truly broken free of, I would call, 500 million years of one form or another of control. And therefore, these wars, which all could be avoided, they're not objectively necessary. But because we did not build intentionally strong nation states, and nation states that provided for the welfare of the people, most of these wars are people fighting each other for scraps of existence, or to promote one leader or another who they think will give them more of a return if he's elected or he's in charge than the other guy. So you're fighting over fixed and sometimes shrinking resources. The welfare of the people has gone down in many cases, or stagnant. And the conflict comes from people looking to survive and do better, but there's no movement of any of these countries, most of them, where there's an actual national policy to expand the wealth and provide for more material standard of living, improve material standard of living for the people. So that's the overall reason, and none of this is going to be solved. And we can look at all the cases. The worst case now today is Sudan, and you can go back and trace the policies of the failure of policy of the Anglo-Americans over many, many years. Will often be one of the prime underlying causes for this conflict.
Um, if you do a little survey of Africa, and let's look at the poverty, or maybe coming somewhat out of poverty uh, in different regions of Africa, looking at what would be the desired creation of a skilled and prosperous workforce.
Mhm.
Is there any progress that's happened under these terrible circumstances in recent decades? Where is there any progress, or what is the actual situation of poverty and deprivation or lack of that in Africa?
Africa as a continent is 54, 55. There's one disputed nation. So it's a continent of over 4 dozen nations. But it's the only continent in the world where poverty, as measured now by under $2.15 a day, below that is extreme poverty. It's the only continent in the world where poverty is growing.
Oh my God.
There's
Yeah.
about 450 million Africans living in that level of poverty. That level is increasing each day. Now, as a percentage of the population, it decreases because the population reproduces very quickly. But it's the only place. The other areas we had poverty, of course, was China, and China brought approximately 750 million people out of poverty. India, other parts of Southeast Asia, they are all reducing the total absolute number of people in poverty. Africa is not, it's growing. Now, there are extreme pockets of poverty all over the continent, mainly in sub-Saharan Africa, that portion of Africa below the Sahara Desert. The northern countries are slightly different. But in the sub-Saharan Africa, you take Nigeria, which has about 225 million people, and the reports are that 90 million live in extreme poverty. So that's not quite a half, but it's more than 1/3. That is destroying Nigeria every day. You look at other areas where the rates of poverty are not quite as dramatic because the population isn't as large. So unless you deal with poverty, unless you eliminate poverty, unless you eliminate hunger, all these problems are going to continue. Now, there are areas where various governments are trying to make progress. I would say the most interesting, from my standpoint, significant is Ethiopia, which is the second most populous country with about 120 million people, and also has extreme poverty. But they have a pro-growth policy, and they did something that no one else in Africa has done. They self-financed and built what's called the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, GERD, which will produce 5,150 megawatts of power. Now, that's not enough electricity by any means, but it's the biggest infusion of electricity on the continent.
In the book that I'm just about to come out with, the second volume of my book, Who We Are, I have a photograph, a beautiful photograph of that dam in Ethiopia provided by the embassy to show this something in the right direction. Go ahead.
Well, the electricity, for example, the lack of electricity is the biggest killer in Africa. It's not AIDS, it's not tuberculosis, it's lack of electricity. Because as we know, in any modern civilization, such as the one you and I are in, electricity is everything. I mean, it's necessary for vaccines, for schools, for production, for every possible means of existence. And in sub-Saharan Africa, again, which is about 47 of the 54 countries, there's no electricity. It's under 100,000 megawatts. So divide 100,000 megawatts by 1.5 billion people. It's nothing. And so the significance of Ethiopia is by actually adding just 5,100 megawatts, they will become the second largest producer of energy in sub-Saharan Africa, second to South Africa,
Well,
which has
what would be the best, most effective route to get the necessary electricity being generated in Africa?
well, you have to have a full-scale, top-down commitment that you're going to do this. Now, the Ethiopians did have that, and they did it, but it's still minimal. And now it's hydroelectric power, and there's a lot of rivers throughout all of Africa. The problem is you depend on rain to some extent. The best way to go for expansion would be nuclear energy. There's only one single nuclear energy plant on the continent, South Africa, which was built under the previous apartheid regime. There are 15 or so African countries that are in various stages of discussion of nuclear energy, feasibility studies, and I believe in Egypt, working with the Russians, Rostom, they're building 2 to 4 nuclear energy plants. But back of the envelope calculation is for Africans to live like you and I are living here today, they need about 1,600 gigawatts of power to have a minimum of 1,500 kilowatts available to them 24/7. The same thing on railroads. There's no railroads. This was done intentionally by the colonialists and neo-colonialists. There is some expansion on railroads, but they need about 100,000 kilometers of rail to cross this gigantic continent. And there are plans to do it over the next 40 years, but that's taking far too long. But there is a plan for a high-speed rail integrated network, which some people are working on, and I support them. But these are the kinds of things that are just driving the existence of the standard of living of people down. You have people in the informal economy. I hate the informal economy. When I first saw it in 94, I was disgusted, and I still am. But people go to the informal economy, selling goods along the side of the road, because they have no other means of survival.
Or stealing, like pirates or terrorists. Right.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. You look at Nigeria, which I know well, been there many, many times since 1994. And even the wealthy who build walls and fences around their homes, all of them do, even they're under attack because gangs of 30 or 40 people come with jackhammers and they break down the wall and they kill people. A friend of mine was killed, or a parent of a friend of mine. So there is not going to be any solution. The so-called democracy, so-called human rights, it's all nonsense unless you address these issues. You're not going to change anything. And I'll leave you with a friendly slogan my friend gave me when I first went to Nigeria in 1994. I'm still in touch with him. And he said, the poor in Nigeria don't sleep because they're poor. And the rich in Nigeria don't sleep because the poor don't sleep. And that's the truth. Because as long as you have near 100 million people living in poverty in Nigeria, nothing's going to change substantially. And that's the reality across much of Africa.
I want to go to the U.S. role in Africa in this era, since, let's say, since the death of Kennedy, President Kennedy. There's a corruption in both the U.S. Military establishment and intelligence, and overlapping with these other international authorities that you mentioned, the IMF and what was the other thing? IMF and
World Bank.
World Bank. Okay, so I want to, if you go back to Abraham Lincoln, just for a minute, indulge me here. when he came in and we got a civil war, he had to establish a loyal and effective U.S. military. The military was completely corrupt before then. Jefferson Davis, the head of the Confederacy, had been Secretary of War in the previous decade. Robert E. Lee was head of West Point for a time in the 1850s. There was private armies going into Mexico and into other countries to invade them, try to spread slavery. And all of this corruption of the military was directly against the national interests of the United States, ending in this insurrection to try to destroy the country. We also had that corruption in our State Department and our diplomacy, notably towards China and towards Mexico. Again, against the American national interest and for a foreign imperial interest that the people who were corrupt in our military and diplomacy were connected to. So Lincoln cleaned this out. He finally got pro-national generals, Grant and Sherman, and he got some good diplomacy. And he also set up loyal scientists and good industries. So if you think about, getting a new policy, maybe we have a chance to do that under the current circumstances. How would the United States play a constructive role, presuming that we had a U.S. government that served the interests of the United States? How would the U.S. government or the U.S. as a nation play a constructive role in Africa in the present era?
You started with President Kennedy. And I mean, when President Kennedy came into office, and he, as a U.S. senator, he had spoken out in favor of the Algerian Revolution against the French, 1957, as a U.S. senator, which nobody even came close to, and he did not get a lot of support for that. When he became president, he made a decision that he wanted to court the Africans. There's a book to that title. And he did. And he brought in people into the State Department who were going to work with him on reaching out to the African, because this was the African liberation time. Kwame Nkrumah liberates Ghana in 1956 from the British, and he becomes sort of the father of the liberation movement, which continued from the late 50s throughout the 60s. And Kennedy brought people in who were going to work with the Africans because he saw it as a potential for development. And this overturned the Eisenhower policy and the previous Truman policy that governed the United States and the U.S. State Department. And he formed, as you know, a very close working relationship with Kwame Nkrumah, who became the first president of any country in the world to be honored with a state dinner in March of 1961 by John Kennedy. He chose an African to be the first president to honor with a state dinner. And that gives you some, and then his work on the Volta Dam project, which he's still recognized for today, 60 years later. So we have to have a complete radical change in the outlook of the U.S. The U.S. has not since Kennedy, that's 60 years or so, actually had a conception that there's an interest in the United States helping Africa. We have a self-interest. You're going to have, according to various projections, about 2.5 billion Africans by 2050. Over 1 billion will be 35 and under. It will be the largest workforce in the world. And in fact, some projections say US and Europe will be importing African labor to make up for the shortage in the West because we don't reproduce so much anymore.
Yeah.
So that think about it, 2.5 billion people, one projected to be 1/4 of the world's population. This is the center, really, of political, economic, commerce, and development for the globe. It's the areas where there's most undeveloped land. It's the areas of the greatest infrastructure deficits. So if anybody was thinking, and I really don't see it in the current political leadership in this country, but if they were thinking, they would say, we got to develop this area. Otherwise, one, Boko Haram and the terrorists we see today are going to be peanuts. And two, we're going to lose out on tremendous economic potential. So what the U.S. would have to do is actually reverse its thinking, which is now puts Africa at the bottom of the list of concerns by both the Republicans and the Democrats. They all have rotten policies or no policy. So what we'd have to do is say, no, this is important. And the most important thing to do would be what Hamilton has done and others have done and Roosevelt did, which is support and work with the African leaders to electrify the continent and bring railroads. Have the way Roosevelt had his electrification program in the United States. They need electricity, electricity, electricity. They need railroads. They need these basic infrastructure. So we could do it one of two ways. We could establish an infrastructure bank in Africa, which we could capitalize and lend low interest, long-term loans, or a more radical proposal is we could make these grants, give them the money, not ask for a return, because the profitability from the investment will pay for any expenses that we've given. But we're too stupid right now in the United States leadership and the population to do that. But that's what's necessary, and it's necessary now. I don't see the new administration making any greater progress than the previous administration.
Well,
and that's unfortunate because this should be a primary concern if we were thinking strategically. But a wholesale radical transformation of policy is necessary.
I think it starts with dedicating the national government to fulfilling the national interest of the United States, defining that, understanding that, looking back at our history, seeing how that was done in the past, seeing what that actually means. What is the national interest of the country? How is the interest of the people the national interest? And how is the national interest not served by allowing a contrary power to dictate to us and cause poverty in our country and throughout the world, this transnational imperial power? I think if you start with defining the national interest and saying that the government is only legitimate that serves our national interest, then automatically you are going to do a survey. In the modern world, everybody is interconnected by trade and the flow of population and communications. Otherwise, you're going down into hell. So automatically, if you're serving the national interest, you're going to look at how our national interest would be served in the way that you said, this powerful center of development. Let me ask you about the role of these two countries, China and Russia. Let's start with Russia. What is Russia's role in Africa today that you may know about?
Well, they have a mixed role that over many years, because they were involved in supporting some of the liberation movements, and then some of the liberation movements in Africa were connected to other liberation movements going on around the world. The connection to Cuba at the time
You mean
was
the
also
Soviets were
yeah, I'm sorry, the
Soviet
Union.
Soviets, yeah.
Right, correct. They've done two things. They have promoted economic development in certain limited areas, such as I just mentioned, working with Egypt to build either 2 or 4 nuclear power plants in Egypt, which could be completed within a few years. That would be a huge development. And they've had similar developments with Sudan, some port development, and other areas. They've not gotten heavily involved in railroad building, which the Chinese have. The other side is they've supplied a military capability, what was then known as the Wagner Force. Now it seems to go under a different name, which supplied military alliances with various countries in Africa. So they have played a role, but it's been much less aggressive and robust than it should have been and could have been. But it's still there today, and of course they've also now become connected to the various coups that have taken place in the Sahel, particularly Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. And they've been blamed for the coups by the West. This is the last 5 years, and which is wrong. The coups were caused because of what we discussed earlier. The people were suffering under Western and in particular Francophone French regime. So the people turned to Russia, and there were a lot of pro-Russia signs at the rallies. But Russia didn't cause these coups, did not even instigate them, but they did take advantage of the benefits of these, I think 5 countries in total kicked out the French and the Americans out of the Sahel. China is a totally different story.
Well, tell me, what do you give a picture of China's involvement in Africa, and what's their role, and how do you evaluate that?
Well, China, don't forget, goes all the way back to once it became the new China, as it's called, on the Mao Zedong in 1949. They supported a lot of liberation movements in Africa, as did the Soviet Union at that time. So there are long-standing historical ties that go back 75 years. But in the more recent period, and then they did involve themselves in 1975 on building a railroad in Tanzania. It was because the IMF wouldn't touch it. So they actually built the first railroad, modern railroad, then modern railroad in Africa, which is now being repaired. But in 2000, the Chinese made a big decision to invest heavily in the development of Africa.
2005?
Well, 2000 is when they started the FOCAC.
Oh, 2000. Okay.
Yeah, the conferences, China African Conferences for Development, the Forum on China Africa. And they have meetings every 3 years. So there's been 9 of them since 2000. They also began during this roughly the same period having their foreign minister, no matter who it is, the first countries he visits in the January of each new year are to Africa. There's an unbroken tradition that's gone on for maybe 15 years or thereabouts. They have a real commitment to Africa. The West has got it all wrong. They make these nonsensical arguments that China is a new colonialist power. It's ridiculous. They make the assumptions that China deliberately has forced African countries into debt so China could seize their assets or seize some of the financial capabilities of that country. Never happened. There's not one example that anybody can give. China made a real commitment, as I say, in 2000, both with the FOCAC, and then in 2013, when President Xi Jinping announced the Belt and Road. They have built and contributed to building, both in terms of financing and also in terms of manpower. They have built and contributed to building with African nations more infrastructure than the rest of the West combined over the entire period of Western domination. And don't forget, when the liberation movement started in the 1960s, the West, and the United States in particular, was in the driver's seat. We controlled and had support and worked, and Kenya was, of course, exceptional, but with Africa, it was ours to develop. Chinese were nowhere on the scene.
Could have done that, yeah.
We dominated. And then we didn't take advantage in the best sense of the word in terms of development. And China moved in, and they have built more infrastructure in terms of ports, electricity, railroads, they take the lead on, uh, schools, highways. I mean, the list is enormous. From I guess about 150, 170 billion dollars of investment. Now there's still the loans to China are still, I mean, an extreme minority of the debt that African countries have. It's the largest debt to a country, between 12 and 17% of their debt. But it's pale in comparison to the debt to the Western banks, the bondholders, and the hedge funds and sovereign funds. But they actually built something with these loans. For example, Ethiopia, they didn't lend the money to Ethiopia. Ethiopia funded it themselves, but they helped build and finance the transmission lines. They are all over Africa. When I go to Nigeria, when I go to Ethiopia, you see it everywhere. The Chinese construction projects are ongoing. And the West tries to say, no, now they've decreased. The last FOCAC meeting wasn't going to lend any money. And Chinese put in a project for 50 billion for infrastructure for Africa. And this is real. It's a real it's a real relationship. It's not perfect, but there is a real relationship between the African continent and China. Now, China eliminated 750 million people out of poverty through known methods. They're the best country in the world positioned to help Africa eliminate poverty. And this is a sign of optimism, as bad as poverty is, because it means it can be done. It was done in China. So there's an existing fact. I'm not saying it's a model, but it was done. So it can be done. And China says they want to modernize Africa as they want to modernize their country, especially now through 2035. Many in the West poo-poo this, they're taking advantage. We don't see their loans. They don't care about human rights. But one former foreign minister in Liberia said, if you remove Africa from the last 20 years, if you remove China from the last 20 years in Africa, nobody would have filled that vacuum, and the continent would be poorer today than it is. The Chinese have made a huge investment physically and politically. Now, from my standpoint, it's much too small because I gave you some of the figures of what they need. But they at least are building something, and the West has now one project that they just put out, which will take many years to build, a corridor to extract critical minerals from the DRC in Zambia through the port in Angola. And that project will take years. It's not even been looked at in feasibility. And that is it. That's only infrastructure from the West in 60 years since Kennedy.
Supposing that the United States, resumes what was at our best, our development idea, the idea of progress, for which this country was founded and fought for at various times against the empire. Suppose that we resume that idea of progress and we terminate the conflicts that have been developed by the imperialists between the United States and Russia, United States and China, and so forth. And supposing we cooperate and we do our part, which could be a great part in the development of Africa, the redevelopment of the Middle East and other places, but Africa is a great center. Supposing this happens, the change in the life of the people of Africa, of different countries, I know there are different situations, you're going to be changing. Critics would say you're changing the lifestyle of people, traditional ways, traditional lifestyles. You may be destroying the soil by intensive agriculture. You may be, I'm not going to talk about wildlife and whether a rhinoceros has this customary place to drink water. I don't, that's too ridiculous to bring up right now. And that's a concern of King Charles and people like that. Let them go and talk to the rhinoceroses. But there's a historical question that's serious about things, for example, about the deterioration of the quality of the soil. If you're having the wrong agricultural policies, for example, we had that problem in our farming, as particularly in the South under slavery. We had it in the Midwest with the Dust Bowl. So the big change that would occur in Africa in the lifestyle, changing traditional ways, bringing about intensive modes of production, including electrification. What would be how would that work? What's the reality of that kind of change? And what are the possible negative consequences of industrialization in Africa? What do we have to, what's the reality we have to look at?
Well, I was just reading an article from an African, and his figure is that Africa contributes 1.9% of manufactured value in the world global economy. 1.9%. It's gone down. It used to be 2.5%. And most of that, some of that, majority of that probably comes from South Africa, which is the only nation that has a semblance of a manufacturing capability, although it's declining or stagnant. So the Africa makes no contribution to the wealth of the world. Now, if you look at agriculture, it's unused. Take the Congo, which now has constant been wars and fighting over mineral resources and critical resources, which are still going on. But the Congo has the greatest potential of agricultural production in the world because of the moisture. It's the second wettest basin next to the Amazon basin. Last time I looked, so I could be off by a percentage point, about 5 to 7% of its land was being cultivated, of good land. And of that 5 to 7%, a tiny fraction was being even mechanized, or irrigation was being used.
You're talking about the Congo Basin or a country?
I'm talking about the Democratic Republic of the Congo,
okay,
which is in the Congo Basin.
Yeah.
They could feed Africa and export to the rest of the world. Sudan had that capability before it was divided up in 2011. Studies were done in the 1970s. When I was traveling to Sudan, I saw the agricultural people, and they could have fed the Africa at that time, which was about 1 billion people. So there's no reason for anybody to go hungry in Africa. And they waste $45 billion of reserve currency, because no one accepts any African currency on the world market. So it has to be in yen, euro, pounds, dollars, etc. They spend 45 billion of their limited currency, hard currency, to import food, which is a waste.
Who's importing that food? You're saying the Democratic Republic of Congo or other?
No, Africa as a whole imports 40 to 45 billion. That is in hard currency. I'm saying the DRC has enough agricultural land to feed all of Africa if it had to, and then export. And they are exporting some of the African countries do export food to China. But that's just one country. I've been all over Nigeria. They can be self-sufficient. Ethiopia, to their credit, is now expanding agriculture and expanding infrastructure, irrigation. But there's so much potential. Then you have all these minerals, which have been up to this point totally taken out as an extractive industry, which is not really an industry, it's just looting. Because
what kind of minerals?
Well, oil up for the past 30, 40 years, oil was the main one. And they destroyed Nigeria with this. Now you have cobalt, you have copper, you have lithium, and there's a movement in Africa by many different countries, including South Africa was taking the lead. They had a wonderful former foreign minister, Natalie Pandor. She resigned. But now what she said and others are now saying is we're not going to let any minerals leave Africa without what they call benefiting us, that is, having a manufacturing processing capability. The same thing in agriculture. You have Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, 1 and 2 exports of cocoa and cashew nuts, and then they buy the processed chocolate back into their country. So
Yeah.
if there was manufacturing and processing built in Africa, which is now a sizable movement among African nations, together with electrification, together with railroads, because food rots, because they don't have refrigerated cars. I mean, simple things like we
That's
take for
old,
granted.
and that's old technology.
That's old technology, but they lose up in some cases up to a third of the crop rots because they don't have refrigerated cars and they can't get the product to the market, even though the market inside Africa itself, 1.5 billion people, is huge. They can't even get to their own market because of the lack of infrastructure. So now I made a proposal at the United States Institute for Peace about 10 or 15 years ago, which is a think tank supported by the US government. It's right across the street from the US State Department. And I said, why don't we break out of this controlled environment of the rules-based order and have China and the United States unite together for a mission, a joint mission to end poverty and end hunger in Africa. But we'll have all differences all over the place. But let's do this as a way of breaking the controlled environment, of pitting us against each other. Let's give this as a gift to Africa, a gift to mankind. 1 or 2 people were interested. I made the same proposal at a conference I spoke in Beijing on the second week of September. Mm-hmm. This is what we could do. That China is a tremendous asset to our self-interest and could be together in alliance between the 2 nations, could transform the world for centuries to come. If we took 450 million people out of poverty and industrialized Africa. Industrialized Africa is a dream. And most people think it can't be done. I'm one of the few people who insist it can be done. But if we did it, look at the change we'd make for the next century. It'd be mind-boggling and produce happiness across the planet.
Africa was the subject ever since the 1700s of a British and probably other countries, but definitely British policy of effectively prohibiting the import of machinery into Africa, because that would raise the value of labor in Africa. It would raise the price of labor. Their people would become, a skilled workforce, and then they couldn't get them out as slaves. So Britain had that policy that was discussed in the Parliament.
And that policy existed well into the 20th century.
Yeah, but that's right, exactly right. So, but you mentioned the word gift, that we should give this kind of development aid to Africa. Now, people who self-styled conservatives or libertarians who are against foreign aid, of course, they're right to recoil at the so-called military aid, which rains down into destruction all over the world. You want to save a lot of money, you can save that kind of aid. But looking back at our history, when the federal government and also even state level governments, but the federal government in particular, made investments in infrastructure and education and other needed things in the United States. And of course, the space program is the obvious example of this in our era. The return on this generosity of our national government was always many, many, many times what pittance we put out to, being generous to our own people. And the same thing happens with other countries. We are, you go back to Kennedy uh, and also FDR. These people were anti-communist. They were worried about communist appeal.
Mhm.
And so they said, well, how are we going to counter the appeal of communists? They put themselves on the side of these people. That's the way they're posing in the world. And of course, so why don't we put ourselves on the side of these people and therefore build up our influence and build up our trading partners and build up civilization?
Mhm.
Civilization is our best protection. It allows us to carry on a civilized life here and to go ahead in our own country. It's so obvious to people who are not hysterical that that kind of generosity that's keyed to uplifting the power to produce, the power to spread civilization. That's in our immediate interest.
Well, it's even better than that because if you add up the amount of USAID, which is primarily food, and I went to USAID distribution point in northern Ethiopia right at the end of the war, and there's thousands of sacks of 50 kilograms, 100-pound sacks of food that people carry on their backs, but it helps them survive the month because they don't grow enough food. So USAID's budget is gigantic, billions and billions. You take that, you take the military budget to so-called kinetic warfare budget to fight terrorism, and take in the Sahel region, which was probably billions and billions of dollars. Those those two expenditures would be eliminated
Yeah.
if you actually help build the infrastructure for the fertile land to produce food for people. So you actually, even though the conservatives and the libertarians are too silly to think this way, you would actually be saving money and
Exactly.
making progress for humanity at the same time. But people are so restricted in their think. Like, for example, I say, let's get a bank that can loan money for infrastructure. Where are we going to get the money? Where are we going to get the money? We just came up with $200 billion to fight a war in Ukraine. We can always get the
Do
money
Vietnam.
because it's credit. But the fact is, no one can think that way. The thinking level of the American population, the moral level, the cultural level, has so declined since the death of Kennedy that we have to get our own Americans to realize what we can do. And we need some leaders who will inspire them to do it. I don't see any at the moment. But it's obvious to me, and then to you and to others, that we can save money and make progress in the world for humanity.
Well, the libertarians, I think most of them that I know uh, are style themselves as pro-life, and they're discussing abortion, but take people at their word. You're pro-life. That's a good start. Uh, why not? Here's a case where people are creating life. They're having babies over in Africa. Why don't we protect that life
Mhm.
and set an example by promoting life in this way? All it takes is a little bit of stepping back from the hysteria of the U.S. role in the world. Right now it's the popular conceptions of our role with foreign countries like Latin America or Africa conflict zones. I don't think people think much about Africa otherwise, except for the conflicts. Step back from the hysteria. Consider your deepest feelings about what it means to be human and how people should treat each other. And then see if you can connect that to our national interest and the interest of other countries.
Right.
And you could become a lot happier rather than simply reacting against this and that outrage of our present regime.
Right.
There's so many ways that we could be happier if we were actually contributing to civilization. So do you
Well,
have any?
you have these NGOs,
Go ahead.
non-government organizations, so-called, and they fight for human rights and they so-called fight for democracy. And I always challenge them. I said, if you actually concern yourself about human rights, then you should have building electricity infrastructure at the top of your list, because you're never going to develop human rights if you don't support, as you're saying, the right of a newborn child to even live. You're not going to have democracy if people are fighting each other over scraps of food. If you go back to our country, the history of our country, we used to have town hall meetings. We used to have hundreds of people listening to Douglas and Lincoln, standing there and just listening to hours of debate. You need leisure time. You need a standard of living to read and debate and discuss the issues facing your country. So these democracy movements, in my view, are fraud. Human rights movements are all fraud, unless they take up the question of satisfying the material standard of living of this population, which, as we say, is the fastest growing population on the planet and will dominate the planet in the next generation or two.
I think that's a good way to close, Larry. Thank you so much. A lot
My
of
pleasure.
food for thought.
Yes. We
Okay,
need a lot more food.
good.
All right,
Thank you.
take care.
All right, bye-bye.